From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Can Republican Larry Hogan pull off an upset in Maryland's 2024 Senate race? He's giving it a go running as a centrist. Plus, Texas Governor Greg Abbott declares victory after defeating more Republican state lawmakers who torpedoed his school choice program last year. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleague, editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. The Senate, as a reminder, is split 51-49, and whether Democrats retain control or whether Republicans retake it in November will have a huge effect on the next 2 years, whether President Biden or maybe President Trump can get through anything of his agenda or will run into a brick wall called the Senate filibuster. There are a handful of highly contested seats, but my colleague Mene Ukwe-Barua has been reporting from Maryland. That is a state that is not normally thought of as a swing Senate district, but former Republican Governor Larry Hogan is making a run. Let's start with a clip of Larry Hogan making his pitch in an ad to voters.
I want to say this up front. In the Senate, Republicans can't count on my vote. But then again, neither can Democrats. If they want my vote, they'll have to do what is right for Maryland, not one political party. That's exactly what I did as your governor, and exactly the kind of senator I'll be. I'm Larry Hogan, and I approve this message because we won't fix Washington without independent, common-sense leaders who bring people together.
Mene, your report on the Maryland Senate race is in the paper today under the headline, Larry Hogan runs for Senate centrist. But if you could give listeners a sense of how this race is shaping up and where'd you go and what did you see when you were on your reporting trip?
So, as you mentioned, Maryland, not commonly thought of as a swing constituency when it comes to any kind of statewide race. But we have seen it completely transform over the course of the past few months when Larry Hogan decided to run. Of course, he was governor of Maryland for 2 terms from 2014 through 2022. And was extremely popular during that time. He really built bridges with a lot of Democrats in the state and tried to govern in a way that was popular with all Marylanders, restrained taxes, which had increased a lot during his predecessor's term, Martin O'Malley, and was just known as a good, common sense, solid public policy style governor, and was able to work with business, was able to work with unions, and was very friendly and very well liked. So by the end of his term, his approval rating reached 77%, which is just about as high as you'll ever see for any politician representing a constituency as large as an entire state. And he also helped to burnish his credibility by being a vocal critic of President Trump in a very democratic state, particularly his culture warring policies and his election denial after the 2020 election. And so Hogan now is entered the race and has shown that he was actually leading the Democratic candidates in most of the early polls, again, despite the fact that President Biden and President Trump are going to be in the ballot in the fall. It seems like a lot of Maryland voters are open to potentially selecting a Republican if that Republican is Larry Hogan. So the polls are very close right now, but we'll see how the race shapes up as he continues to traverse the state and talk to voters and make the case that he'll be a different kind of Republican who will be able to govern in their interest.
One of the things that stuck out to me in your report is that Larry Hogan was spending an afternoon with the International Longshoremen's Association. You have a quote there from the local union president saying that he's good for business. And that's an interesting dynamic. It seems that Larry Hogan, in his tenure as the governor of Maryland, I'm sure built bridges with some of these voter groups that are not traditionally thought of as the Republican base. But the fact that he can go there to the Longshoremen Unions Association and have some pulled pork, and the local there will give you a quote about how Larry Hogan is good for business, I mean, that says something about his ability to reach out to different coalitions around the state. So what are the specific groups that Larry Hogan needs to win over as he is trying to face down the Democratic nominee?
One constituency he needs to reach out to would be moderate Democratic suburbanites who are critical of President Biden's performance. And of course, if you look at President Biden's approval rating, you know that that's a pretty big constituency in just about every state in America. And so there are a lot of people who traditionally would vote Democratic, but who have felt the pain of inflation and are looking for someone who's going to be able to go to Washington and be a policy check on a re-elected Biden. They might want President Biden to continue in office because they just can't bring themselves to vote for Trump, but they want to make sure that spending is going to be restrained in Washington in a way that's going to help control federal budgets and also going to help to restrain inflation. Another constituency Hogan needs to reach out to is Black voters, who are about 30% of the Maryland electorate. He had about a 60% approval rating among Black voters by the middle of his second term as governor, which again is very, very high for a Republican candidate. And he needs to try to see if he's able to build on some of that and attract these voters to pick him again in November for the Senate. Of course, his opponent, the Democratic nominee, Angela Alsobrooks, is Black herself, and she's the executive of a majority Black county in Maryland, Prince George's County. But Hogan is going to make the case that I've been in your communities. I've passed policies over 8 years that benefited you on economics and also on policing and crime, and you can trust me to be your advocate in Washington. So those are just two of the different groups that Hogan is going to try to appeal to, despite the fact that they tend to lean Democratic historically.
Did you look much at Larry Hogan's record as governor? Because when you think of a Republican governor in a blue state like Maryland, it raises the question of how he won this state in the first place and then left with an approval rating of 77%. And that's not totally unprecedented, because I'm thinking of Charlie Baker, who for a while was the most popular governor in the country, the governor of blue Massachusetts, Phil Scott in Vermont. So it seems like sometimes there are voters in blue states who like it when taxes don't go up, like it when the economy is doing well, and they like it when there are not big fights in the state house and the legislature over expansions of government programs, the kinds of things that you see in Illinois and Chicago. When a guy like Larry Hogan comes in and he puts a pause on things for a while.
Yes, I think that's exactly the playbook to get elected and also to remain popular as a Republican governor of a traditionally Democratic state. And I'm thinking of my own home state, New Jersey, when I describe this, because our most recent Republican governor, Chris Christie, did very much the same thing. To get elected, you basically have to be the successor to a governor who raised taxes quite a lot as a Democrat. And that was true for Larry Hogan in Maryland. He was succeeding Martin O'Malley, who passed a tax increase that was deeply, deeply unpopular. And that's how Hogan was able to get elected. And then once in office, basically restrain some of the worst excesses of Democrats who are in the majority in the legislature, who will often continue trying to raise taxes and increase spending and other policies that voters know are going to be damaging to the local economy. And that's exactly what Hogan did. He used his veto pen very often to curb excessive spending and tax increases. And the most important thing on top of that, I think, is just getting out there and building relationships. As you mentioned, his relationship with the unions. That, again, is not a historically Republican constituency, but particularly at the Port of Baltimore, it's very, very important in the state of Maryland. And being able to bring in federal grants for infrastructure in the state, that's one thing that Republican governors sometimes do that they believe is helping the budget of their state without having to raise taxes or go into debt to do so. And so being able to deliver something to certain constituencies without stretching conservative fiscal principles too much. So those are kind of the elements that worked for Hogan, kept Maryland in a pretty good state in terms of having a budget surplus when he left, and have made him very popular with a lot of the important groups there.
Hang tight, we'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. One of the reasons that I think it's worth talking about Maryland is because if Larry Hogan is able to get some traction, it scrambles the calculus on how these Senate races might fall. Remember, it's a 51-49 Democratic Senate. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin is not running for re-election, and so that is a clear and probable Republican pickup. And then there are 3 states that are ranked as toss-ups. Nevada, where Jackie Rosen is running, Montana, where John Tester is running, and Ohio, where the incumbent is Sherrod Brown. And some of those states you could imagine going either way, depending on the campaigns, the strength of the challengers, the strength of the economy, but particularly if President Biden wins re-election and then has a Democratic Senate, it seems clear to me that the Senate filibuster is on the chopping block. Some of these candidates who are running have supported filibuster reform, as they have euphemistically called it in the past. They include Ruben Gallego running in Arizona to replace Kyrsten Sinema. They include John Tester, who has talked about going back to a talking filibuster. They include Sherrod Brown and Jackie Rosen. They've said they're open to changing the 60-vote Senate rule in some fashion. Let's listen to another Senate Democrat, this one not on the ballot in November, but maybe shed some light on the thinking in the Senate. This is Democratic Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona on NBC News early in May.
Would you support getting rid of the filibuster in order to support abortion rights, to codify Roe v. Wade into law?
Yes.
You would?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, and when we were looking at voting rights legislation, I voted for that as well. I spent 15 years at NASA flying the space shuttle. If NASA had the rules of the United States Senate, the rocket ship would never leave the launch pad. So at times, at the appropriate time, I think this is one of them, I would consider, changing those rules to make sure that women can get the health care they need.
Monet, I don't find that a convincing analogy. Building a rocket ship is a technical problem with pretty straightforward answers on how much thrust you need and so forth, whereas the Senate's job is to make policy for a nation that spans a continent and includes 330 million people who have deeply held views that often conflict on all sorts of very difficult issues. But it does seem that the filibuster is on the ballot. And so that's part of why I think there's an interest in Maryland. If Larry Hogan can get over the line, then it makes it more likely that there will be a Senate majority or at least 50 Senate Republicans, make it harder for Democrats to get together the 50 majority they would need to break the filibuster. And so, Monet, the Cook Political Report, one of these groups that handicaps these races, is still saying that the Maryland race, even after Hogan's entrance, looks to them like a likely Democratic seat. I'm curious if you think that is underrating Hogan's chances.
Well, first of all, I have to go back to that Mark Kelly clip and just talk about how sweet it is to hear him basically lay out the entire progressive ideology and self-image. They believe that all of their policies are building a rocket ship, essentially, that EV credits and expanding abortion access and all these things they're basically just rocket science. They should be evident to anybody who studies the fundamentals, and anyone who disagrees with them is just someone who hasn't learned their physics and needs to be pushed aside by any means possible. So thank you, Mark Kelly, for being very clear about how you understand American politics. But I couldn't agree more about the stakes of the filibuster being on the ballot for how the Senate is decided this fall. And that is very much part of Larry Hogan's case for being elected. Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, both of whom are going to be leaving the Senate, are the only two Democrats who are on the record saying that they wouldn't vote to abolish the filibuster, which means that by all likelihood, if Democrats retain control of the Senate, they are going to have a majority in favor of pushing the filibuster aside, and any of the priorities that they have, whether it's abortion or whether it's another big spending bill, they're going to be able to force through without having to build a 60-vote majority. And Hogan certainly is an institutionalist. His father was in Congress. He very much is in favor of upholding the rules of how Congress works and making sure it remains a deliberative and representative body. And so he wants to preserve the filibuster, absolutely. So Maryland voters should know that that's part of the stakes when they go to the polls. But I do think that Hogan still faces an uphill climb to be reelected. Some of the early polls when he first declared showed him with a comfortable lead, and I think that's in part because of his massive name recognition compared with his potential challengers at the time. But if you look at the most recent polls, you actually did see him trailing Angela Alsobrooks, who's the Democratic nominee, as she started to run more ads. She's raised a lot of money nationwide, and voters have started to recognize her name. It is still a heavily Democratic state, and people know that sending Hogan to Washington will be empowering the Republican Party, no matter how much they like him. So there's still definitely a chance that he'll be able to pull it out, given how popular he is. But there is also a high likelihood that voters are going to come home to the Democrats in the fall. And so he's going to have to continue to raise money and campaign very hard if he wants to stay in it.
Hang tight. We'll be right back after one more break.